Morning, brothers. So today we're going to be looking at Constantine and the events leading up to Nicaea, a little bit of Nicaea, and what followed that great council. So Emperor Constantine has been one of the most controversial figures in history, especially in church history. He's one of those guys that is either loved or hated without a whole lot of fence sitting. So most people do not sit on the fence, but you're either one way or the other with Constantine. What is the controversy with Constantine? We're talking about the emperor of the Roman Empire. What would be a controversy with him? Well, it is that he, as the emperor of the Roman Empire, claimed to be a Christian and in many ways united church and state together. Those who oppose Constantine see him as destroying the purity of the early church, that the early church was united around things like pacifism, struggle, poverty, and truth, and united together in persecution. These opposers believe that once Constantine came and legalized Christianity, that it got all muddied up with the state, believing it was better for the church to remain completely separate from the state. Therefore, today the church should return to an earlier primitive Christianity by rejecting any connections to the state. On the other hand, those who embrace Constantine often go into the other ditch and see the unification of church and state as a great thing. That it should be like this, that church and state should be united together, and so these supporters in our days will often embrace a socialist agenda, seeing the calling of the church and the state to be the same, two sides of the same coin. Therefore, the feeding of the poor, the care for less fortunate, the pay of pastors, the ownership of church buildings becomes the job of the state, and the church simply aids in that mission. These are really two ditches. You have ditches on either side of the road, and you're either in one or the other. The goal is to stay on the road. And history is often much more complex than these simple solutions that we oftentimes offer. Now, what about the reality of Constantine? What we need to remember is that the persecuted church in the first 3 centuries longed for persecution to end. Think about how many prayers went up over the years for the Roman leaders. Right? We're called to pray for our leaders, our civil rulers. We're called to pray for them. How many prayers during those first 300 years of Christianity went up for the peace of the empire? How many times did the church follow Christ's admonition to pray for those who persecute you? Finally, along comes an emperor who ends the persecution. This is an answer to prayer. In order to maintain the purity of the church, should he have continued the persecution? Well, that doesn't really make a lot of sense either, does it? What is an emperor who claims Christ to be a Christian? What is he to do? It would be like if you in India suddenly had a Christian president elected who ended persecution, and then Christians got upset with him because while the persecutions were going on, at least the church was interdenominationally united in opposition to a persecuting government. No, wouldn't you want the persecutions to end? Even though you might have a flawed president. Here's the question, what should or would a Christian emperor look like in Rome? What would a Christian ruler who may have been a pagan worshiper of Apollo look like? What would he behave like? What would he rule like? Would this ruler immediately be a mature Christian? Or would he need to start off as a baby Christian and work towards maturity? What kind of cultural influences would he have to overcome in his life? God raised up. Here's the main point. God raised up a man named Constantine who was born in Serbia. His father, Constantius, was a general who, in the army, in the military, who may possibly have been a sort of closet Christian or a respecter of Christianity. I mean, Constantine even had a sister named Anastasia. And Anastasia that word means resurrection. Why would a Roman name his daughter Resurrection? So while father and son were stationed in Gaul and then in Britain, in 306, Constantius got sick and died in the town of York in Britannia. Constantine was recommended by his ailing father to take over the leadership of the army there, including being one of the Augusti of Rome, and his troops agreed with that and put Constantine up. Now, what is an Augusti? By the time Constantine was born, the size and growth of the Roman Empire had made it difficult to manage. It was so large, stretching from Persia in the east to Britain in the northwest. To ease its management, the kingdom was separated into 4 administrative districts or units. 2 Augusti, Augustus means majestic in Latin, 2 Augusti oversaw the western and the eastern parts of the empire, respectively, with the superior of the 2 possessing the title of Augustus. And under these 2 emperors were vice-emperors, each holding the title of Caesar. So basically you have 2 main leaders, and each has a vice president, if you will, or a vice Augustus, or what they would call a Caesar. And as you can imagine, this governmental structure created much competition and constant struggle between, so it wasn't the best solution. Constantine's father served as a Caesar, and then later on had moved up into the position of Augustus in the western part of the empire before his death. When his father died, Constantine was declared emperor by his troops in York, in Britain there. And the problem is, there was another Augustus claimant to the throne there in Italy. And his name was Maxentius. Now, despite the odds that Constantine had against him, and he had a smaller army, but he had a loyal group with him. He had a loyal army with him, despite the odds that he had of this smaller army in the northwest. He decided to march down to Italy and to claim his throne. Now, keep in mind that this is the time of the Diocletian Empire, and the empire was ravaging Christians at the time under the worst persecution yet. So that's always, keep that in the back of your mind. So Constantine began working his way down to Rome and met the other emperor, Maxentius, at the now famous Milvian Bridge battle in October of 312. Now, it was around this time that Constantine, as he's approaching Milvian Bridge, just before he approached Milvian Bridge, he had a vision in the sky of the Chi-Rho. Remember the Chi-Rho? I talked about that and showed you a picture of it. I've talked about that before. That symbol was a Christian symbol standing for Christ. The letter Chi and the letter Rho put together, standing for the first 2 letters of Christ's name. Now, it had been used before by Constantine, actually, and it was not new with him. As Constantine saw this symbol, though, in the sky, he is supposed to have also heard the words spoken by God in Latin to him. And it said, by God, by this sign you will conquer. By this sign you will conquer. Constantine took that as an omen that he would be successful in his battle. So he placed the Chi-Rho on the shields or banners of his army and went forth to fight Maxentius' army at Milvian Bridge near Rome. And by the end of the day, Constantine had defeated the much larger army of Maxentius, and Constantine gave credit to the Christian God for his victory. And again, can you imagine a Roman emperor giving credit to the Christian God for his victory? This vision and victory in battle in some ways marked the conversion of Constantine to Christianity. Although ultimately unknowable, only once we are in glory will we know, but ultimately unknowable, Constantine appeared to have had a legitimate conversion. Things changed, in other words, for Constantine, beginning at this point. Now, upon his arrival in Rome, he refused to offer a sacrifice to the Roman goddess Victory, which is a ritual that every emperor preceding him had ever performed. Although we will never know if Constantine really understood Christianity, he demonstrated interest in it and eventually favored it and was baptized on his deathbed. In 313, Constantine and his co-emperor in the east, Licinius, issued what is called the Edict of Milan. The Edict of Milan ended the persecution of the Christians. This was an amazing time. It was a great thing. The persecution of Christians is over. And the Edict of Milan also allowed religious freedom across the empire. This is incredibly significant that this would happen, because this is the first time in history that there was religious freedom in the world in an empire. First time. Never happened before. And so something was changing in Constantine. Something was changing in the Roman Empire. And here, for the first time in all of history, there was religious freedom in the world in an empire. Because empires, before that, always were connected with a religion, a particular religion of the area. Constantine saw himself from this point on as a Christian. And the Christians were overjoyed because all the persecution against them was ended. Wouldn't you be overjoyed as well? Poor, battered pastors and bishops were now free from fear of persecution. What a glorious and wonderful thing. Now Constantine began to help the church as well and sought unity in the empire. These two went hand in hand in the mind of Constantine. He wanted the empire united to stop all the quarreling amongst the leaders. He thought, perhaps naively, that the Christian church could help in this unification as he favored it above the pagan Roman state religion. As we've discussed, the early church had conflicts during the first 300 years. They had to deal with heresies like Gnosticism and Montanism and Marcionism and Docetism. About the same time, Constantine was becoming emperor and defeating Maxentius at Milvian Bridge. There arose a new conflict in Alexandria, Egypt. And this arose between Alexander, who was the bishop, and one of his presbyters, whose name was Arius. Arius was trying to protect the transcendence and oneness of God, so he said, and began saying that Jesus was the firstborn of creation. And the motto of the Arians became, "There was a time when he was not. There was a time when Jesus was not." Now, they were meaning that Jesus was the firstborn of creation, that he was a created being. There was a time when he was not. God had to create him. Now, as one can imagine, this divided the church almost immediately upon freedom from persecution. Here they've had their freedom of persecution, and now the church is divided between Arianism and Orthodox. And Arius was a persuasive speaker, and so many attended to his side. Now, Bishop Alexander was disturbed about this and held that the Word existed eternally with the Father. At issue was the divinity of Jesus and the relationship between Father and Son. Alexander said for Arius, Jesus is not true God. He is not true man either. Therefore, he cannot be the mediator between God and man. Alexander said that. And Arius said, "Oh yeah? Well, you deny monotheism because there are two who are divine in your system." Alexander retorted back that because Arius denied the divinity of Christ and the church had worshipped Christ since the beginning, and so the church must now, if Arius is right, either cease such worship or declare that we are worshiping a creature, which indeed would be idolatry. Arius fought with Bishop Alexander over this, and many people began to follow his teaching. That is, the teachings of Arius. And everyone in the city was arguing over this. You were either with Bishop Alexander or you were with Arius, and butchers and bakers and candlestick makers, all the people of the city were talking about this. Now, in one sense, that would be an amazing thing, that everybody in the city is talking about Christ. and who he is. Now, Arius was young. He was cutting edge. He was popular. He was sort of the cool guy. I mean, he was cool, man. And he could really make some great songs. One of them went like this. Arius of Alexandria, I am the talk of the town, friend of saints, elect of heaven, filled with learning and renown. If you want the Logos doctrine, I can serve it steaming hot. God begat him, and before he was begotten, he was not. Well, that's a great rhyme. And that rhymes, and that's very catchy, and a very catchy tune that he would serve up with that. And so people started singing some of the Arian songs. In fact, later on, Athanasius would attack Athanasius and his songwriting. And you can read some excerpts of that if you look it up and Google it. Now, as a side note, I bring this up because music matters. Writing good, theologically sound music is very important for Christians to do. If you have any talent with music, write good, solid, theological, Christ-honoring, triune God-honoring songs. And put good tunes with them, put good lyrics, and people will sing and they will get good theology. Now, eventually Alexander and Arius had Arius deposed. And so he was taken away as being a presbyter. But Arius kept teaching and gathering folks around him to his side. He was not going to succumb to the deposition. And so there became a huge division in the Greek-speaking Eastern Church over Arianism. Arius eventually appealed to some other bishops as well that liked what he taught, and Alexander appealed to other bishops and talked about the heresy of Arianism. And then there was so much disruption that Emperor Constantine got involved. Such fighting threatened, you see, to divide the church, which in Constantine's mind was a tragedy. He had intended that the church would be the mortar that held the empire together. And this is when Constantine decided to organize an ecumenical council at the town of Nicaea, just outside Constantine's new capital city of Constantinople, in 325, in AD 325. So, he called the bishops of the empire to come and have a council at Nicaea in order to come to a decision over this theological issue. Because he believed himself a Christian, and because he was the emperor, he believed that he ought to intervene in all the affairs that went on in his empire, including religion. Religion had, after all, always been connected to the Roman state. But here's the point. The emperor, the state, was now intervening in the affairs of the church. In fact, he even sat in the council himself. The emperor sat in the council at Nicaea, sort of presiding from his chair off to the side, all dressed up in his emperor's regalia. But again, the questions we need to ask are, what was an emperor to do? What was a Christian emperor to do, especially in a world that had never even considered the idea of separation of church and state? How was this bad for the church and for the state? And how did Constantine benefit the church during this time? Now, this became known as the First Ecumenical Council of Nicaea in AD 325. With about 300 bishops from all over the entire empire coming, and the majority of them, though, were from the east. For the first time, this showed them visibly the universality of the church. There were black Africans, there were blonde-haired, blue-eyed Scythians, there were Spanish, there were the Gauls from what we now know as France, there were the Romans and Greeks all gathered together. But there were also two main groups. They broke up into two main groups, the Orthodox and the Arians. They argued about all the issues and debated. So intense was the debate that at one point the Orthodox had gone on one side of the river and the Arians on the other side of the river, and the war cry of the Orthodox became the Gloria Patri. Glory be to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Ghost, as it was in the beginning, is now, and ever shall be, world without end. Amen. Amen. Now take that, you Arians. And the Arians, on the other side, had their own unorthodox battle cry. However, things changed when one of the major proponents of Arianism, Eusebius of Nicomedia, stood up to give a defense of their position. He believed if he could just explain it simply and clearly, all would understand and vindicate Arius. As he started to assert that the Son was no more than a creature, the assembly exploded with angry protests of, "You lie! Blasphemy! That's heresy!" Well, this resulted then in a quick rejection of Arianism, really. In order to combat this heresy and other similar heresies, they decided to form a creed that stressed the divinity of the Son. That in order to be orthodox, one must be able to hold to this creed, and so these bishops and presbyters began to debate how to put this creed together. The debate was over the triune God and Jesus' deity. Was Jesus God and man? Was he equally God? How do we say that? What words do we use? Bishop Alexander had a deacon with him named Athanasius, who clearly articulated the importance of believing that Jesus was God and man, fully God and fully man. That Jesus was both the eternal creator and of one substance or essence with the Father. That word was homoousios. The debate came down to defining terms. Is Jesus homoousios? The Orthodox said of the same substance. The Orthodox were holding to homoousios, which means of the same substance. The radical Arians said Jesus is heterousios, that is, of a different substance than the Father. And then there developed the moderates who were trying to reach a compromise, and they said, let's say Jesus is homoousios, that is, of similar substance with the Father. Well, homoousios of same substance, heterousios of different substance, or homoiousios of similar substance. Which was it? Which was it? One little letter made all the difference in the world. One little iota ended up making the difference between orthodoxy and heresy. The Orthodox side won the day through the faithfulness of Alexander and Athanasius, and they came up with an early version of the Nicene Creed. And in that creed, we have statements: begotten, not made; begotten, monogenes; and being of one substance with the Father, one substance, homoousios, which helped combat the Arian heresy. 2 years after Nicaea, Bishop Alexander of Alexandria, Egypt, died, and Athanasius became Bishop of Alexandria. During this time of unrest in the church between the Arians and the Orthodox, Athanasius was the one who faithfully and continuously stood up for the truth of the divine Christ. Athanasius was banished because of that from his bishopric in Alexandria numerous times. He continued to fight for the deity of Christ, and at times it seemed like he was the only one left that was orthodox. And it was said, Athanasius against the world, and the world against Athanasius. Now, one of your readings this week is the book on the incarnation of the Word, which clearly explains what Athanasius was saying. It is Athanasius Magnum Opus, his great work. And I do have it in Hindi as well, thanks to Isaac Singh and Jonathan George, who translated that a few years back. Now, all of this was finally resolved in the Second Ecumenical Council of Constantinople in 381, under the supervision of Emperor Theodosius, and that developed the finalized creed that we now know as the Nicene Creed, officially the Niceno-Constantinopolitan Creed. However, there was a lot of things that had to happen during those 6 those 60 years or so between the first ecumenical council of Nicaea and the second at Constantinople in 381. So at the Council of Nicaea, it was not finally able to really settle the Arian controversy. It was not completely successful. It was a good beginning. By 327, 2 years after Nicaea, Emperor Constantine the Great began to regret the decisions that were made at Nicaea. Amazingly, here is the emperor regretting the decisions that were made at Nicaea, and he granted amnesty to the Arian leaders and allowed the banished ones to return to their churches, including Arius to Alexandria, where Athanasius was. Aware of the emperor's political programs for unity in the empire and his ambivalence towards absolute truth, that the heretics really took advantage of Constantine's waffling back and forth, and they became very bold in the words that they had, and to propagate and spread their error and their falsehood. So open opposition to the Nicene doctrine of the Trinity and the eternal deity of Christ resumed, and it was back. Now, a year after that, Alexander, Bishop of Alexandria, and the stabilizing champion of Trinitarian orthodoxy, like I said, died. And so Athanasius had to stand in the gap, and he did exactly that. And we're going to talk about Athanasius a little bit more as we go. In the meantime, specifically just about Athanasius, really, and what he did. That's a story on its own, and so we'll cover that the next time. But in the middle of the century, in the 360s, 361 to 363, there was an emperor that came onto the throne, and he was a nephew of Constantine, and his name was Julian. Now, Julian was known as the apostate once he became the emperor, because he apostatized. He had been raised as a Christian, taught as a Christian, schooled as a Christian, but when he became emperor, reverted back to paganism, and he hated Christianity. And so he wanted to indeed bring the empire back to paganism. And so he thought that if he could get all the different sides of Christianity to fight against each other, that they would self-destruct. Well, he ended up dying in a battle with the Persians just outside of Antioch. And the emperors that followed the apostate restored Christianity's status. So it was very short-lived, this reversion to paganism. Another heresy emerged that further divided Christians.